Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Gilad Aini, and I'm a senior researcher at CAMRA. We're honored today to welcome Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, who will be giving us an in-depth look at one of Israel's most pressing challenges, the country's strategic situation in the face of threats from Iran and its various proxy forces. It's a challenge that's surely been on most of our minds in recent days as Iranian rhetoric has become increasingly strident, even as its ability to defend its airspace has been increasingly ineffective. Beyond Iran and its nuclear ambitions, Israel faces a network of Iranian-backed forces across Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Gaza. On top of those challenges are the diplomatic attacks at the United Nations, and of course, relentless media distortions when covering all of the above. We're left with urgent and multi-layered challenges for Israel that demand both military preparedness and diplomatic strategy. To help us explore these critical issues, Dr. Lerman brings to us decades of experience and expertise on Middle Eastern affairs, Israeli defense, and global diplomacy. He's currently vice president at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, where his work illuminates the complex security environment Israel faces today. And not for the first time. Previously, Dr. Lerman was deputy director of Israel's National Security Council, and before that, held senior posts in IDF military intelligence for over 20 years. With advanced degrees from the London School of Economics and Harvard, his analysis is informed by both rigorous study and extensive field experience. So please join me in welcoming Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman. The floor is yours.
Gilad, thank you. It has become a kind of a mantra to say that Israel is facing a war on 7 fronts. We know that 7 is a kind of poetic number, biblical symbol, but actually it's more like 10 fronts that we are engaged in with varying levels of intensity. Right now, the most intense operations are going on in Lebanon, where 4 divisions of the IDF are slowly and steadily clearing up segments of southern Lebanon and doing what a UN mission, UNIFIL, a large force of some 15,000 well-armed and well-paid soldiers from around the world have utterly, totally, and miserably failed to do anything. And so that's the mission. The main mission now is to make South Lebanon unsafe for Hezbollah so that the north of Israel will once again be safe for its inhabitants to come back to their homes. So that's one of the 10. The second is in Gaza, where, and I would say this frankly, due to the lack of decision and the lack of coherence in Israeli policy, we have not yet substituted Hamas rule for an alternative model, whether it is an Israeli governance, which the IDF and many others in Israel are reluctant to establish, or an alternative. Some would offer us the Palestinian Authority. I think it's a joke, not because of ideology, but simply because they are incapable of carrying that burden. But others, myself included, have advocated some international interim presence for a good number of years until the de-radicalization, restabilization, and reconstruction of Gaza are well underway. But for the time being, there's no decision, and as a result, we find ourselves sending the IDF again, like Division 162, that had to reoccupy Jabalia essentially for the 3rd time now, destroying hundreds and capturing many hundreds of Palestinian terrorists, of Hamas terrorists, losing 19 of our best in the battle. There are, of course, important benefits in destroying and even and in capturing Hamas operatives as well as Hezbollah operatives in the north. It diminishes the myth of the invincible resistance front, but it is a long and painful and I would say, Sisyphic work in both cases. And the notion of an early decisive outcome, the holy grail of Israeli strategy for generations, continues to elude us, even as we grind the enemy into and destroy their infrastructure, destroy the huge tunnel systems, both in Gaza and in South Lebanon. But it's a long and tough fight. But perhaps the most significant front, and you have already alluded to it, is the Iranian front. If Iran actually follows through on that heated rhetoric that we've been hearing from the supreme leader on down, then Israel's hands will finally be free, unlike the situation in the previous round, to go after fundamental strategic targets. We have a choice or a mix, perhaps, of three different sets of targets, leadership targets. And as we saw, we can reach and hit key targets even inside Tehran, if necessary. Leave aside all this, according to foreign sources, Haniyeh was eliminated by Israel. Even the prime minister recently owned up to that operation, so we need not repeat that standard phrase. So leadership targets, qualitative strategic targets that could undermine the stability of the regime. Specifically, we're talking about the oil export infrastructure upon which the economy of Iran totally depends. It's already gone into a nosedive over the last 24 hours for fear of a different American attitude towards Iran. But it will go into a much deeper state of collapse if we, for example, disable the Chag Island export facilities and so on. And the third target, the one that can make this entire conflict, this entire struggle into a turning point in history, in our modern history or post-modern history, is actually an effective destruction of the key elements of their nuclear project. For years, we've been forced to worry that any action that we take will, first of all, could be very costly because they have formidable air defenses. Secondly, would trigger a massive Iranian rocket attack. Well, that happened already. And finally, would trigger a Hezbollah's massive action against Israel. Well, we are suffering periodic missile and rocket attacks, some of them with very painful results, like in Metula, where a farmer and four of his Thai workers were killed recently. Others were killed on the roads and in their fields in northern Israel. But if you compare, painful as it is, if you compare the numbers of the actual results of the Hezbollah assault so far to the nightmarish expectations that were apparent in Israel before the war began, we know now that this is not a deterrent to Israeli action if we come to the point where we feel that we are entitled, we need to, and we can take this kind of action. So Iran, the third front, in addition to Lebanon and Gaza, is the active front that Iran opened up with us in the night of the 14th of April and again on October 1st. And we are, I think, now in a position to exact a much higher price if they try again. So these are the key three of the 10, as I said. But add to this Houthi operations, both against the trade with Israel and with the rest of the world in the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea, and the occasional launch of a long-range drone or ballistic missile from Yemen to Israel. There has been some American and coalition action against the Houthis, but unfortunately it has been very limited in nature. disappointingly so. It is focused on their military capabilities. It does not involve that element of deterrence that comes from exacting a price for their actions. Israel did take twice a high price in Yemeni infrastructure, but unless this becomes more effective, they will not desist. And the sad truth is that we've lost one of our 3 ports to Houthi action. Because Eilat, excuse me, Eilat no longer functions as a trade port for Israel. Tourism internal tourism is doing more or less better than before, but as a port, Eilat has been disabled with all the consequences. This is a serious matter. We went to war in 56 and in 67 to open the route to Eilat, and now we've lost it again, and that will ultimately require some very careful planning for forcing the Houthis to desist. Another front, some intermittent trouble is on the Syrian border, and within Syria we continue to conduct operations related to what has been called CBW, the Campaign Between the Wars, which has been going on now for 11 years, basically since 2013, to grind down and break the supply lines that from Iran via Iraq through Syria into Lebanon, supporting Hezbollah. We've been more effective than some people would admit in actually disabling some of these deliveries, limiting the capacity of Hezbollah to make their missiles accurate, for example. But it remains an active front. I would take note of the fact, in recent weeks, this has become more acute, that the Syrian government as such is doing its best to stay out of this, for the simple reason that Assad has no intention of checking out what kind of air conditioning there is down where Hassan Nasrallah went. And so he's always been reluctant. Like his father, he is risk averse when it comes to Israel since 73. That's a long time. The Syrians have not initiated any action against us, despite the fact that the Golan is still in Israeli hands and they have a grievance, an active grievance, but they have not taken action. And in fact, they have now here and there made it more difficult for the Iranians to use Syrian soil. Whether this would lead to a general bust-up, I don't know. Assad relies on both the Iranians and the Russians to keep him in power. And their purposes are not the same. The Iranians want to use Syria as a launching pad. The Russians want to keep Assad in power. This is not the same purpose, and the tensions are beginning to show. From Iraq, the militias, the elements of the Popular Mobilization Forces, as they're called, Hashd al-Sha'bi, that are loyal to Iran, not all PMF are Iranian owned, but some are Iranian proxies, and those who are launching drones into Israel once or twice a week, more or less on average. There were 2 detected coming in tonight north of Eilat, both destroyed. But it's a nuisance rather than a threat. But it's a painful nuisance, and ultimately it will require some kind of pressure on the Iraqi government, which is there as a gift from the West in many ways, to put an end to this. Jordan, which we tend to think of as a peaceful border, is becoming into a problem, not because the Jordanian regime is actively looking for trouble. It's not. They badmouth us. They initiate all kinds of actions in international fora, but that's another matter. Militarily, there has been cooperation going on for years and years, but we even supplied them with old attack helicopters at one point. But the Iranians are increasingly trying to use their channels into Jordan in order to stabilize the kingdom and to open channels through which they can penetrate the West Bank via Jordan. Because if the West Bank is to become the next Gaza, as Khamenei stipulated back in November 2014, 10 years ago, almost to the day, if it is to become supplied and turned into a base of operations against Israel the way Gaza was in its day, then Jordan must be destabilized to the point in which the Iranians can use its territory with impunity. So that is becoming an issue. Elements in Jordan, hostile elements in Jordan, have been mobilized against us. There was one attack at the border crossing, the bridge, that took 3 Israeli lives. There were other incidents. There are almost nightly attempts to penetrate across the river Jordan. I assume that all of you have seen it at one point or another, and you know it's neither the Mississippi nor the Amazon, or as that famous joke goes about the cardinal who had a quick look and said, this river sure had some good PR. It is a creek that you can cross without getting your chest wet, and with a package on your back. And the temptation for the Iranians to turn Jordan into a base is becoming acute. Interestingly, the channel for doing it go through the supply route of the artificial drug Captagon that the Syrians produce en masse, more or less the one important source of income for the Assad regime, and smuggle into Jordan and via Jordan to the Gulf and to the world. And these smuggling channels are being increasingly used also for penetration for other purposes. So we need to keep our eyes open and our ears, and to keep a more significant IDF military component also on this longest border that we have. The West Bank is restive. There have been various terrorist attacks, ramming by car, knifing, bombing, the catastrophic attack at the light train in Jaffa, at the border in Tel Aviv, coming by 2 tourists from Hebron. And so the IDF is spending every night raiding terrorist infrastructure in Tulkarm, in Jenin, in Hebron, and elsewhere. It's an ongoing challenge, and it's not going away soon, although the great majority of West Bankers have stayed out of trouble, and the Palestinian Authority is neither here nor there. It's not actively committed to fight us the way it was under Arafat in his day, but it is also not extremely helpful. So that's another active front. Here and there we have had trouble with Israeli Arabs, notably much less than we could have been led to expect in a war in which tens of thousands of their countrymen, of their Palestinian brethren, have been killed in the Gaza war. We all challenge the numbers that the Palestinians use, but we've certainly killed the number of Hamas operatives killed goes into 5 digits. And so in a war of that intensity, we could have expected more trouble of the kind we had in Israel in May 2021. The time of Operation Guardian of the Walls hasn't happened yet. However, there have been sporadic terror attacks by Israeli Arabs, again, ramming, knifing, the occasional bombing. We need to keep an eye on that as well, while we also fight the plague of criminal violence in the Arab sector, which involves a huge amount of arms, small arms that are available in the Arab sector in Israel, and that's easily shades over into nationalist violence or terrorism. And finally, we have as Gilad already said, as Camera knows all too well, because you are one of the key units in the field or key tools in our operations. We have a war of delegitimization going on that extends from the streets of and the yards of campuses all over the United States and the streets of major cities and all over Europe, and of course this in this infamous institution, the United Nations, or what organization, what has become of it. So delegitimization both in many ways the two dangers that we face in a war which we cannot bring to a kind of decisive outcome conclusion that as we did in 67 and frankly even in 73. This is a long war of attrition against an asymmetric enemy deliberately designed to cause significant number of casualties among the uninvolved, I mean the non-combatants, and as a result, the combination of attrition and delegitimization generates the deepest challenge down the road. And I should add very quickly, because my time is running out, that in addition to the grand strategy problems, the lack of a coherent vision about the day after in Gaza and in Lebanon, we also have a problem at home. I will not hide it from you. A very large number of Israelis have come to view the dismissal of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant as related to the political maneuvering around the question of mobilizing, if not the entire ultra-Orthodox community, at least those young men among it who are not active, intensive yeshiva students, but basically just use the exemption to shirk their duties, which should be the same as that of every other young person in Israel, certainly at the wartime when some of our reservists have served 250 days after a year, and some have not returned, and some have returned maimed, and their families are worried sick. And amidst all this, a segment of our society has decided that they couldn't care less, or they don't care enough to, as we say, get under the stretcher. That's the idea, the military expression, and this is becoming increasingly intolerable. And I'm not sure that we've seen the last of the political fallout from this decision by Netanyahu, because even among the extremely committed and fantastically contributing element of the modern Zionist Orthodox, whether they are on the right or on the center right, in the settlements or elsewhere, they have been willing to sacrifice a lot. By and large, they support the existing government, but it has become impossible for them to accept that while they're sacrificing disproportionately for the defense of Israel, the ultra-Orthodox have determined that this is not worth their trouble. And I think it's generated an intolerable situation which could lead to a governmental crisis. It certainly has led to significant demonstrations last night and to a lot of pent-up anger that I cannot rule out a scenario under which this would bring down the government. But Netanyahu, as you know, is a master of political survival. So we will have to basically wait and see. Any questions?
Okay, thank you for that. good news is we've made it this far into the program with no breaking news of an Iranian strike. And if that's because the Ayatollahs are too busy watching this webinar, then hello out there. But yes, let's move ahead with some questions and answers. As you mentioned, Iran recently promised to strike Israel with a bigger barrage and bigger payloads than in its previous attacks.
And interestingly, they're now talking about something that I've been discussing with my American friends in the mid-90s, which is missiles which are essentially MIRVed. You remember that term from the days of the Cold War competition, multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, MIRVs. That's to say, you can launch one Khorramshahr missile and dozens of payloads will be scattered as it comes in. So we are increasingly looking at a need for us to intercept at the ascent and not stage and not at the descent stage. That's an extremely complicated technological challenge. So that's becoming even more dangerous. Yes.
Do the THAAD interceptors intercept at the ascent stage or only once they're coming down?
Descent. No, descent. They're essentially equal or nearly equal to our Arrow systems. They began to develop at around the same time. I was there in military intelligence in the 90s, in the 80s, sorry, as a young man when the Reagan administration, I should say, Caspar Weinberger, through his clenched teeth, invited us to join in this Star Wars fantasy. And look, we ended up being the first with a deployed weapon. But still, it's a challenge, it's a major challenge, and much rests on our ability to exact an unacceptable price if they do that.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think you belong to the realist school of international relations.
Well, I'm more of a construction. I'm more of a constructionist. I believe that like-minded nations do lie together in the same pen.
Okay. Okay. And what about in terms of the rationality of the Iranian regime? Would you view this potential strike as a rational move, a realistic attempt at deterrence, or is this more ideology eclipsing national interest?
This is exactly an argument that I've been having when I was still a soldier with my colleagues in Langley and across the river in Washington with the DIA. This is not raison d'etat. This is not about deterrence and the calculus of what Iran feels is a threat by Israel. This is driven by a deep ideological commitment to our destruction as part of a much larger correction of all that is ill in the world from a Shia historical point of view. It is also an opportunity for the Shia ideological leadership in Iran to make the point to Muslims around the world, look, we are doing to Israel, we will do ultimately unto Israel what all these Sunni traitors, all these Sunni weaklings have failed to do or refused to do. So this is deeply, deeply ideological in nature. And it is not raison d'etat, it is raison de révolution. Within that generally irrational motivation, there are, of course, rational calculations. This is what is meant by the famous term bounded rationality. It's the rationality of a madman who can calculate. Sometimes I read to my students the text of Hitler's conversation with Haj Amin al-Husseini in November 42, and he's basically explaining to him how rationally he cannot do this and he cannot do that. I have to make serious calculations. We have to fix the Russians first and so on. Basically, he sounds very rational in the context of an utterly irrational, mad project. So the Iranians remind me of that. bounded rationality in the context of a deeply ideological, irrational drive for Israel's destruction, which would serve no Iranian purpose insofar as Iran as a nation, as a people, as a state is concerned. We have to remind ourselves, we used to be friends. There's a monument in Israel to Iranian Israeli friendship. It's 200 kilometers long, and from time to time it leaks with serious ecological consequences. It's the Eilat Ashkelon pipeline, built with Iranian money, which we did not return, to facilitate Iranian oil exported to Europe. This is rational in the context of national interest. There is no Iranian interest served as such in going after Israel. There is a deep ideological drive of the revolutionary regime served by it, and that's how we should look at it.
So do they prioritize Israel's destruction even over their own survival?
I wouldn't say over their own survival if, they need to survive in order to fight another day. That is a basic Shia concept. They are even entitled to lie and hide their purposes. There's a concept in Shia called Qiyah. If you face a powerful enemy, then you can dissemble and you can play games for a while. But so there can be a rational calculus, but ultimately they cannot afford to look to themselves, to their people, to others in the region whom they have mobilized to fight for them as weaklings. And so I increasingly think they will strike, although they now, as of last night or this morning in America, have a new element thrown into their calculus, namely, what will Trump do?
So another question about those Iranian missiles. The previous barrages were already some of the biggest ballistic missile barrages, at least that I know of. And if there's little precedent globally, it certainly felt unprecedented for Israel. And for the casual observer, I think
the first one was a mix, so there were not that many ballistic missiles. The second one was a formidable attack, did some damage, did hit some of its intended targets, but with a limited peripheral damage and no. The only person killed was a Palestinian from Gaza, ironically, who somehow made his way to Jericho to work there, and was killed by I think by a part of a missile that fell after an interception. There was some damage done. You cannot deny that. There was a major hit on a school in Gedera that luckily was empty. It was aimed at a nearby Air Force base, but ultimately it wasn't a success, to put it mildly.
Although I'll say, watching the missile slam into Israel made it feel at least a little bit easier to imagine the unimaginable, which is what if Iran does manage to put a nuclear warhead on one of the missiles? Is the regime that irrational? And then the second question is, you mentioned the crumbling deterrence that might have given Israel pause before striking the Iranian program, which is, the no longer formidable Hezbollah and so on. But
Right.
Does Israel have the military capability and the political will to destroy the Iranian nuclear program?
Look, I don't want to go too deep into operational capabilities and the interrelationship with intelligence capabilities. Legend has it that not all Israeli operations have actually been from the air, even in Iraq. And I'll leave it at that. But at the end of the day, we lack some of the capabilities that only one country has, namely the MOPS and MOABs. Those of you who don't know what the acronym stands for, Massive Ordnance Penetrator, and MOAB, I think, is literally the mother of all bombs. These are very heavy bomber-carried pieces of penetrating bombing capabilities that only the United States has, and Israel cannot even ask for it because it does not have the platforms to deliver them. So it would be better. It would be better for the world. It would be better for us. It would be better for America. It will ultimately be better for the regional balance of power if the US were ultimately to join in the effort to destroy Iranian infrastructure. But having said so, even against much higher odds, the political will is there, and I can attest to it, to act against the Iranian nuclear capability for the simple reason that we cannot afford to sit around and wait for them to turn their already enriched uranium into a tooled warhead. These are not one and the same. It's not as if once they have enough uranium enriched to 94%, 235, that's to say, what people call weapon grade enrichment. That doesn't immediately mean they have a weapon. They need to tool it and to shape it so it can be fitted in a missile warhead. This is not as simple as it sounds, but it can be done in greater secrecy than the relatively large facilities needed for enrichment. So it is at the enrichment stage that we have the more, let's say, vulnerable targets. And I think we are growing increasingly close to the point of action in this respect.
Okay. It seems like as much as the Palestinian problem would exist with or without Iran, the road to war, the road to this war at least, ran through Tehran. So would the inverse also be correct? Does the road to peace or at least a quiet run through Tehran? And if so, would that quiet hinge on an internal uprising in Iran? And is that likely at all?
Well, the $64,000 question. First of all, I would. It's more complicated than that. Sinwar made up his own mind, like Arafat in his day, as leader of Hamas. He very much wanted to keep what the Palestinians call in Arabic istiqlal al-qarar, the independence of decision. This is the reason Arafat played always a game between Soviet Union and the United States, between Syria and Egypt, between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Whatever fence he could find, he put his rear meat on it and sat on it, one leg here and one leg there, in order to keep his independence. To some extent, Hamas is not an Iranian proxy in the traditional sense. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is. I used to say it's literally a different proposition. Hamas in English. Hamas works with the Iranians. Palestinian Islamic Jihad pitch works for the Iranians. Different propositions, different actions. We have, I think, a well-established indication that Sinwar's action on the 7th of October was not cleared in advance with Tehran for timing, not for the essence. The essence was well known, but for the timing. And the consequences were quite dramatic because Hezbollah did not join in. And by the time they considered doing it, the IDF was deployed in the north with a 4-division component that made a similar penetration of Israel impossible. And so I wouldn't say that everything passes through Tehran. However, having said all this, clearly, if the Iranian regime falls and is replaced by a pro-Western or at least a reasonably peaceful regime with no interest in spending the resources of Iran on the attempt to destroy Israel, once that happens, this will discourage and break the will and the expectations of the Iranian-backed Islamist terrorist organizations in much the same way as the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the early 90s more or less defanged what has been for many years our main enemy, Soviet-backed Marxist radical terrorism. You know, if you spoke to people in the 70s and 80s, terrorism was something that involved young people who read Mao and Che Guevara and go around with Soviet-supplied Kalashnikovs in the context of a global revolution of the working class. You know, all of this is now as dead as the dodo. What has replaced it is an Islamist creed, some of it anti-Iranian, violently anti-Iranian. Let's remember, ISIS murders Iranians, Daesh or ISIL by the proper name. But much of it under Iranian guidance or inspiration and active military support. So if something fundamentally changes in Tehran and aligns it more with the West, it could make a difference, could make a significant difference. Also, if collectively the West, specifically the new American administration, finds a way of explaining to Erdogan in Turkey also that being a member of NATO and being a member of good standing in the Western defense community does not sit well with the kind of commitment and support that they're giving to Hamas elements. And so both Iran and Turkey, in a very different way and in a very different context, need to be driven out of the picture for us to have any prospect of change in our relationship with the Palestinians.
Well, Hamas and Hezbollah today aren't the same as they were a year ago. So let me do the a version of the job interview question. Instead of where do you see yourself in 5 years, where do you see those groups maybe in 6 months? Or in other words, what does victory in this war look like, and who would or could possibly administer Gaza, and when will we send the residents of the kibbutzim back north?
Well, and not just kibbutzim, Kiryat Shmona has been depopulated, which is painful and terrible thing. These are two different answers. In Gaza, Israel is in a position to create a new reality, and it's a decisive question as to whether this is going to be a reality of Israeli conquest and annexation and settlement, as some people in Israel fantasize. I think not, for a whole variety of reasons, internal and external. Temporary military rule, which is, I think, a very likely outcome within the next few months, at least in northern Gaza. It's not a solution, it's an interim reality, but it could emerge. Had we been decisive in pursuing the option of an international, not a multinational, sorry, not an international. International implies UN. UN, as far as we are concerned, is a poisonous place. But a multinational option could have worked, I believe, had we applied ourselves to it more decisively early on. It's not too late to do it, but it's very late in the day. The Palestinian Authority, which was the, I would say, the pet expectation of elements within the American State Department and so on, well, as I said, regardless of what I think ideologically about partition, about whether or not ultimately we're going to have some kind of a two-state solution, I would say this now. The Palestinian Authority, led by a man who would soon be 90, who has very limited control even over the corridor that leads from his office to the door of the building, is strictly incapable of managing the immense challenge of fixing Gaza the day after. The place is, as we know, in ruin. And so we need something else. It cannot be Hamas. It had better not be the PA. It should not be the United Nations. We've just banned UNRWA for some very, very good reasons and based on good evidence. And And ultimately, it should not be Israeli governance over these miserable 2 million or 1.5 million in Gaza. And while it is nice to encourage many of them to go away, which I doubt will work, it is even that is not going to resolve the question. The problem is whether they end up being 1.5 or 1.7 million is irrelevant to the challenge we face. So I believe that ultimately the best would have been a multinational authority based on Israeli, Egyptian, American, and perhaps other regional players defining a mandate, and a clause such as the one that Amos Hochstein gave us on Lebanon, allowing the IDF to take action anytime we see something bad brewing, which we, of course, did not do in the past. The same goes for Lebanon, but in a different manner. The present IDF operation is not designed to destroy Hezbollah as a fighting. Let's say, reduce it very significantly, as we did already with the Beeper assault and the elimination of the leadership, make it much more vulnerable to internal Lebanese pressures. But ultimately, we are not going to go all the way to the Bekaa Valley up beyond with significant forces, not with raiders, with raiding parties, and conquer the high Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley and the Dahya and clear them out. Hezbollah will still be there at the end of the day, much reduced. And we are going to have a safety zone where we would be entitled to act whenever we detect a breach of commitment. And this is roughly the draft that Amos Hochstein, whom I know personally from my days in government, has come up with. It's not been rejected outright by Israel, but it was, of course, as usual, ancient people, it's subject to a lively debate.
Has the balance of power between Hezbollah and the Lebanese armed forces shifted much? And does that even matter at the end of the day?
The Lebanese armed forces are a tool of government. There is not yet a stable government in Lebanon. The core function is the office of a president. The executive power rests with the office of a president, and there is no president in Lebanon. There has been none for years now. So once this is settled, yes, I believe that once this is done, once a president is elected, the balance of power could shift. The leader of the Druze, Jumblat, has always been a good one for doing this and checking the wind. And he has shifted from an alliance. He used to be anti-Hezbollah, then he shifted into an alliance with Hezbollah. Now you can see him distancing himself. And people in Lebanon, in the open, on television, are saying the most incredible things. One was interviewed and he said, "Do you support a ceasefire?" He says, "No, I want to see Hezbollah destroyed to the last man." And that's a Lebanese talking about other Lebanese. So there is a lot of pent-up anger. There is a lot of maneuvering to corner Hezbollah and to undo what they did to the Lebanese state in May 2008, when they defeated them in battles in the street and took over the port. We all remember how that ended, and other facilities. People were very angry already after the blast in August 20, and they are angrier now. So we have a fighting chance that what we did to Hezbollah could be translated into a long-term change in Lebanon.
Speaking of fighting chance, it's clear that military capabilities are probably the key part in international affairs. But what about soft power campaigns against Israel, which you hinted at, whether we're talking about Qatari media, Qatari money, social media influence operations, UN rapporteurs and resolutions. And of course, we're well aware of the poisoning of students' minds here in the US, at least. I know that these all contribute to making American Jewish students feel less stable, but what's the view from Israel about the impact of those instruments on them? Does it matter if public perception pushes Macron to cut whatever small amount of arms?
That hurt. That hurt because we've rebuilt a relationship with the French after the very unpleasant breach in '67, and that in addition to the direct damage, it signaled the growing power and influence of organized Muslim pressure groups in Europe and emerging also in America. There's going to be a post-mortem of who lost Michigan and who lost China. And it could there are spins on that question that could be very harmful to Israel's friends in America. So look what happened to Harris and Biden because they supported Israel. I wouldn't buy into this, but it's going to come up. So these things do matter, and they require a huge effort, and much of it has been done by camera over the years, and we are deeply, deeply appreciated. We need a better capacity in Israel itself, and we need to be more coherent in our messaging. Let me give you just one simple example. People are throwing around the term genocide. Now, genocide is a purposive activity. You don't say just genocide, with all due respect. I'm not saying that the Chinese are committing genocide in America just because they push fentanyl. It's a result. It's not the purpose. Now, had it been our purpose, would the numbers of Palestinians killed have risen or fallen once we've taken control of Gaza? But the answer is obvious. Had this been in our intent, the numbers would have been rising. Now that we have all these Palestinians pent up in areas which we control or surround. Instead, the opposite has happened. The numbers which were very high in the early stages of combat, because we were fighting our way to control of Gaza through densely populated urban areas, have fallen very dramatically. If you see the numbers, even the numbers the Palestinians used have not moved much in the last few months as compared to those of the early stages of the fight. I'm not saying that there are no, innocents, non-combatants killed in the complexity of fighting such as we've had recently in Jabalia. But we're not talking about Israel deliberately and systemically killing a people. And I haven't heard this obvious and I would say, I would hope, persuasive argument coming from Israeli spokespeople. So basically, we need to do a much better work, and we need you in the field.
As you said, by Hamas Health Ministry's own charts, that's the definition of a plateau in terms of the casualties. Question about sort of broadening out the globe here. I think you were involved in the Madrid Peace Conference in '91. With that experience, were you
from the back, as an intelligence backup?
Did you find the Abraham Accords to be more or less surprising with your background in diplomacy with the Arab world?
I could see the Abraham Accords coming. I mean, we've been in a relationship with Morocco for years. We've been in a relationship with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis for a long time. I think people quote me saying that what was the most dense area in the Middle East? It was under the table. There was so much happening under the table for years. But the breakthrough in coming into the open was, yes, there was an element of surprise involved. And certainly hats off to the people who made it happen, whether it's Trump administration at the time, Jared Kushner personally, but also above all, MBZ at the Emirates and his, of course, the Bahrainis followed suit. They would not have done so if the Saudis did not give them permission. Bahrain is very sensitive to Saudi position. So under the surface, what has fundamentally changed as compared to the days of Oslo is that in terms of the most fundamental terms, the most basic terms, we are on the same boat. We are on the same side. As of the middle of the previous decade, around 2014, when ISIS took over, Daesh took over large parts of Syria and Iraq, I and others have offered the taxonomy of forces in the region organized by camps, ideological camps, rather than by geopolitical or strategic, going back to the constructivist versus realist analysis. There was, and the camp of stability, the anti-revolutionary Islamist camp, the one that opposed Islamist revolutionaries of all colors, whether the Iranian version, the Turkish Hamas version, or the Daesh ISIL version. The camp that came together against all this became increasingly coherent, but it needed courage and encouragement for it to come out of the shadows and become a political reality exemplified in the Negev summit 2 years ago.
How significant would it be, practically speaking, if what we managed to achieve normalization with Saudi Arabia in the near future? And I guess the flip side of that would be, well, maybe not the direct flip, but how concerning would it be? How concerning do you find Saudi Arabia's push for domestic enrichment on its own soil?
Well, that's a tough one. I think ultimately, for reasons of principle, we should discourage them from doing so. But I assume that the US calculus involves the unpleasant question of, if we don't do it, will the Chinese do it for them, with all the consequences that follow. And MBS is a tough cookie, and he has played this game between China and the US quite aggressively. Having said this, again, I think it would be extremely significant if we could reach normalization with Saudi Arabia. I think this is one of the reasons Sinwar jumped the gun, because he saw it coming, or thought he saw it coming. But since I am not entirely convinced that this is around the corner, I would focus on the more practical matters: economic cooperation under the table, intelligence cooperation, and above all, lining up all the necessary elements in the effort to curb the Iranian influence, and specifically go after the nuclear project.
You mentioned China. How does Israel view its role in with regard to the conflict, and just in terms of its contribution to the global stability or instability?
I've had this discussion recently with various people. This is heartbreaking, because we have invested a lot of effort not to become China's allies. We are America's allies. But in order to normalize relations, to give the Chinese a stake in a good relationship with Israel, somebody once said there are three things the Chinese want from us: innovation, innovation, innovation. And we tried to play the game and sing the music with the music as far as we could without alienating our American friends. And of course, we are not selling we've stopped long ago selling the Chinese anything that has any military significance. But we were hoping to do other things that would enable us to have a normal relationship. After October 7th, China made a choice. And it lined up with what some of my friends have been calling the CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis. And it took not only an anti-Israeli position, it took a virulently anti-Semitic position, not in the public domain and in official statements, but the burst of, forgive my language, all of you, of anti-Semitic, well, let me say bile, not what I was about to say, But the burst of this bile in the Chinese governmentally controlled social media has been overwhelmingly distressful. It is part of they've started picking up all the standard anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish power in America, not so much because they don't like Jewish power. They're not coming at it from the Nazi end, they're hating Jewish power. They're coming at it from the position of hating America, looking upon America as the ultimate enemy. And now a way to disparage America is to say, no, it's controlled by the Jews. And this has become prevalent in a country which had known no anti-Semitism, which has taken in Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, which took pride in the museum in Shanghai, which I visited, commemorating this Chinese endeavor. I have a book in my library that about this girl from Europe who found safety and love in Shanghai. And all of a sudden, they turn over into the most, I would say, virulent forms of anti-Semitic tropes, and it will be. It could pass away. We've seen totalitarian regimes turn like this, overnight. Friends become enemies and enemies become friends. But it will be a long while before this scar heals, if ever. And we should be much more assertive in making the Chinese understand that this is intolerable.
And the strong horse theory that with Israel demonstrating its successful military, you mentioned not that it's gaining us friends in Lebanon, but at least some hope and respect in Lebanon. What about globally? Does the success as it is
Well,
in
we've certainly made our hardware attractive and vindicated those who bought it, like the Germans who bought the Arrow 3. And when we are now moving to laser missile defense, which I think we would be once again the pioneers worldwide. In this respect, whatever the Macron does in hosting us in weapon shows doesn't matter. We have built up our reputation and we've built up our export capacity. That's the one silver lining in this fairly dark sky that's over us.
Well, I'll seize on closing with some silver lining there. I know our lunch hour is about up. I tried to incorporate as many questions from the audience as I could, and my apologies to those questions that I couldn't do.
Since you all know my email and my number, please encourage them to pester me by other means over time if necessary. For camera, I'll be happy to help.
Will do. And thank you so much for sharing your insights. I mean, your depth of knowledge on Israel's strategic situation is unparalleled and indispensable. I think I speak for the audience in saying that, and certainly speak for us at Camera. Since October 7th, our team has been working around the clock to combat the flood of misinformation about Israel spreading across college campuses, social media, and naturally the broader media at large. So before we close, I do want to extend an invitation to all of you here today. If you'd like to help in this critical time, please consider joining Camera's email team, media response team. This team consists of volunteer letter writers who stand up against inaccuracies in the media and in schools. And to the extent that many of the letters you see in major publications worldwide are from our team members who are part of a 20,000 person strong network of writers. So if you're interested in joining or know someone else who might be interested, please email my colleague Sarah Miller at smiller@camera.org, and she'll get you signed up to receive our alerts and action items and empower you to play a part in combating media disinformation. And if you don't have time to volunteer, we'd certainly be grateful if you'd consider supporting us with a donation. Just go to camera.org, click the red button at the top to make a gift, Every contribution helps us continue our programs and our campaigns and strengthens our efforts in the battle of ideas unfolding that we're also concerned with and interested in. So thank you again for being with us today. We deeply appreciate the support and engagement, and that concludes our program. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you in future events.